I spent 23 years working for Post Media, Mr. Irving, so I'm intimately familiar with the plight of the newspaper industry. But it seems to me that, as you outlined, the newspaper industry has lost billions and billions and billions of dollars in advertising. And what Mr. Chan is talking about is giving back some millions of dollars. And it doesn't seem to me that you could hope to receive back from Google and Facebook and Workopolis and Kijiji and all the other people who've taken the advertising anything like the amount of money that would be required to restore newspapers to the kind of condition they were in the past. So when you talk about the Australian model, which very much privileged Rupert Murdoch's media organizations, how do you imagine that you would have a collective agreement that would in any way restore the kinds of revenues that newspapers always relied upon, especially newspapers like yours, which had geographic monopolies in the places that they operated? And then I'd like to ask Dr. Geist, I mean, what are the consequences to the evolution of new media forms if we prop up old models?
So I think the question goes to the economics of the business have changed a lot. So the billions of dollars that we used to generate from advertising went towards subsidizing printing costs, went to subsidize distribution costs, huge amount of fixed costs to sort of run a newspaper. In the digital world, we don't need we don't need nearly the same revenue that we once required. But there's really only two ways in the digital world to generate revenue to support journalists. Really, in a digital world, all you need to do is pay for your IT costs and your journalists' costs. So it's a much different structure to operate under. As an industry, we've spent the last 10 years taking out fixed costs, outsourcing distribution, turning into a variable cost, rationalizing our printing operations, and investing heavily in digital transformation. The kind of settlement that we're talking about in Australia is generating, it's my understanding, close to 30% of the newsroom costs, which most of them are signing between 3 and 5 year deals. And those costs will, and that is actually, these are material costs that are material sort of revenue streams that are actually having a huge impact on breathing journalism and bringing journalists back to life. This is based on headcount of journalists. Google, and in our view, is that there's only two companies here that are taking the advertising dollars. These are Google and Facebook, and they're not hiring any journalists. All due respect to Mr. Chan, 10 reporters in CP does not cut it in terms of Canadian journalism. There are programs that they've put out to sort of help use their tools better, and those are great. We appreciate that. But what we're talking about here is a lack of access to the digital advertising market because of two companies. This is really a monopoly situation. We've seen a lot of Western publishers, small community publishers out West, not even bother to transition from print to digital because they couldn't see a path to a future. They couldn't see any access to the digital advertising market to make a go of it. So they've been slow. So that's the reality of it. But I mean, I would say there's no new journalists coming on side except for the 14 organizations that signed up with the Facebook deal are would be a fraction of the 3,100 members that are included with. I would bet you there'd be less than 100 journalists, and currently there's about 3,100 news media journalists in the news media environment. So the kind of settlements, the kind of negotiated settlements that we're looking for. One final point I just want to say, News Corp did do well by that deal. They made a separate deal that was on a global basis for their US and UK properties as well as their Australian properties. but it's our understanding that right now there's 150 small and medium-sized publishers in Australia, of all shapes and sizes, that are collectively negotiating an equivalent deal with Google. And I'm not sure where it stands, but I think they have been talking to Facebook as well. I would encourage the committee to talk to some of the Australians if you get a chance, and some of the Americans on this. There's a fantastic guy named Robert Whitehead who's been advising us on their progress in Australia, and it's quite telling the results they're having and how they're dealing with this. But we've also talked to the market access problem is the number one problem. I mean, last week or 2 weeks ago, that Google was levied a fine of $330 million Canadian dollars in France for antitrust violations. The U.S. government is actively pursuing legislation in terms of antitrust. Amy Klobuchar, Maria Cantwell are both pushing hard on antitrust legislation in the U.S. Senate, and so, I mean, I think you have to really identify what the problem is with clarity and focus, and then figure out what is sort of a meaningful remedy for that can be implemented in sort of an efficient time frame. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and Dr. Geist?
Yeah, okay, thanks for that, Senator Simons. I've got a few things I suppose to say. I mean, I think, it's easy to beat up on Google and Facebook. I think the fundamental issue with those companies, and it responds a little bit to Senator Carignan as well, is that there isn't a compensable use here. I mean, the reason copyright doesn't work is because they're not using this in a way that copyright would typically recognize. But I think that Mr. Irving's response really does highlight the risk of following down the path that he's suggesting. He told us that, we're cutting to the bone. We're down just to IT and journalists. You could bring in all sorts of independent media companies right now who are digital only, who would tell you the exact same thing. The Logic and Village Media and Narcity and Tyee and The Athletic and Cart. I mean, they are doing the same thing. And I would suggest to you that it is entirely possible they do it better, that they are finding ways to compete based largely on IT and hiring journalists. And they're finding ways to provide value to subscribers so that people are willing to pay. There's been a problem with many of the legacy businesses as they wait for government to step in. I mean, we heard, we don't want to strike a deal. We think we'll get a better deal if government intervenes. Is subscribers are leaving based on stuff that just isn't worth paying for in many instances. And independent media is finding a way in many instances to make a go of it. If we intervene and step in, what we are doing is not solving the fundamental problem. We are solving the problem that some legacy companies face. And in doing so, risk dramatically harming those who are actually trying to find ways to innovate in this space.
Thank you very much.